Thank you, Melissa. So hello, my name is Birgit. I came here this morning from Melbourne. The reason why I'm talking about this here today is it's quite timely actually, because I'm leading the review of the Melbourne Water Stormwater Offsets Program or scheme at the moment. We just started recently, so it's quite timely. We can share some finding, which will, I think that will be the key message here today from us, the findings that we made so far. What I'm going to talk today is just a quick introduction in case you don't really know the Melbourne Water Scheme, how it relates to the planning system, its drivers, the scales that apply to the scheme. I'm going to talk about the rate, what the limitations and strengths are of the scheme, we think, and the opportunities going forward that we've found so far as part of our review, which isn't finished. So we're currently reviewing the program, and it hasn't been done before. Up to now, just the rate got reviewed. So this is quite an interesting process for me, and I might not be able to answer all your questions because I only started this recently. So, but I hope I can answer most of the questions if you have any. So, just a quick introduction. The program got established in 2005. It applies to Melbourne Water's area of operation, to new residential developments. That's Melbourne Water's area of operation. So there's Port Phillip Bay there. These coloured areas are the river basin catchments. The blue boundaries are the municipal boundaries. And all these little red areas there, that's basically where we've collected offsets so far through the program. We got this done for this review, which paints quite an interesting picture actually, because as you can see, there's a lot of activity in some areas and no activity in others, which tells quite a story. It's a voluntary contribution available to developers who can't meet stormwater treatment on site. We have two different mechanisms to manage stormwater in Melbourne. We have development services schemes and then infill areas. Development services schemes are located in greenfield areas. They are managed by Melbourne Water in consultation with local government. It's like catchment master planning for stormwater, like all surface water, so pipes, retarding basins, stormwater treatment measures. And then everything that's under 60 hectares gets handed over to local government, and over 60 hectares remains in Melbourne Water's ownership going forward. There's a local rule that applies in Melbourne where that's the way the assets are divvied up between local government and Melbourne Water. Nitrogen is used as a proxy to measure the rate and the contribution charge, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. As I said, the program's currently under review and expected to be finalised early next year. So before I talk about the drivers, it's probably best to talk first about how it all fits into the planning system. There's 4 acts that enable us to run the program. The environmental, so in these orange boxes, the Environmental Protection Act, Planning and Environment Act, the Water Act, and the Subdivision Act. And we don't just have the Stormwater Offsets Program, but we also manage stormwater through, in these dark blue boxes, the Development Services Schemes that I mentioned before, and we also have a regional wetland program to reduce a target that came out of the State Environmental Protection Policies, the SEP. So the key document that is basically drives or why the program exists today, I guess, is the Port Phillip environmental study undertaken by the CSIRO in the mid-90s. And yeah, that influenced what was incorporated into the SEP, which included a 1,000 tonne per year by 2006 nitrogen reduction target for the bay, and that's what this program there contributes towards. Out of the SEP, then the BEPM guide or best practice guidelines got developed, which then fed into the Victoria planning provisions. In particular, in the state planning policy framework, there's 2 clauses in there. Clause 13.02, which refers to BEPM and SEP, and clause 14.02 refers to the regional river health strategies, which includes our Healthy Waterways strategy that so it makes it a reference document in the planning provisions, which gives us quite a good power to implement things for waterway health. Then clause 56 refers to BEPM as well, and that then triggers stormwater treatment requirements on site for development. We use the Water Act and the Subdivision Act that enables us to enter into agreements with landowners. So the Water Act requires Melbourne Water to consent to any works that interfere with quality and quantity or flow of water, and it enables us to enter into an agreement, which then enables us to charge a contribution fee and put conditions onto development, or into planning permits, basically. And the Subdivision Act is the trigger that enables referrals to Melbourne Water. So if there's no subdivision, there's no referral to Melbourne Water, and Melbourne Water misses out on charging contributions or putting conditions onto developers. So that's a bit of a loophole, because not always there's a subdivision happening. So the drivers, really, the key driver are the BEPM objectives, which are stormwater development needs to treat stormwater to these targets: 80% suspended solids, 45% total phosphorus and nitrogen. But what I've only just recently found out, what was sort of a bit buried amongst all the information, was the real driver for the program was that, so these targets came out, and we didn't have clause 56 at that point, and Melbourne Water wanted to take the lead and do something to protect the bay and the waterways. And so, yeah, there was no legislation in place to make local government make developers treat stormwater, so we wanted to bring this program into life to get stormwater treated, especially in these areas outside of development services schemes, in the infill areas, and in older schemes where stormwater hadn't been incorporated yet because we didn't have the targets. Also, there was a recognition that stormwater treatment is not always feasible on all sites. There's certain sites that have constraints, and we acknowledge that, and that's why we wanted to provide an alternative pathway for developers. And what is also, through the stakeholder consultation we've just recently undertaken, what's become obvious is that people keep referring to it as the nitrogen offsets program, but it was really meant to be a stormwater offsets program, and it was meant to protect waterway health as well as bay health. However, because it keeps getting linked to nitrogen, people always just think about the bay, and it was probably, Melbourne Water should have enforced it more or articulated it more to make that more known. And therefore, people often think it's okay to just treat something at the end of the pipe just before it goes into the bay, and the waterway doesn't really matter. And so Sorry, I tried to liven up this presentation. So that's meant to be the bay at the bottom of the person, and the intestines are supposed to be the waterways. So it's my sort of not very humorous German type of trying to enlighten the presentation, because I thought it might be a bit too dry. The scales that the program applies to came out of a study done in 2004 by the Association of Bayside Municipalities, which found that out of all of the development that they looked at, 65% only could meet best practice objectives on site. So there were certain sites that where it wasn't feasible to do that, but they found that sites over 6 hectares large could meet best practice objectives on site. And so it was decided back then that subdivisions, so and underlined that because there's a different, between subdivision and development, which I think, subdivision is a bit of is a limitation. So subdivisions greater than 5 hectares need to be best practice, so are not eligible for offsets. It was also decided sites less than 0.4 hectares don't have to meet best practice and don't need to pay offsets, because it was deemed that sites that small, the stormwater assets would become privately owned, and it was deemed that that was too not practical, because you would need to have Section 173 agreements to ensure they're getting maintained and operated, and that was the decision made back then. Through this review, or from like my knowledge working at Melbourne Water, I don't think that subdivision trigger is a good way to do it, because it should be maybe development size, because some developers find clever ways of subdividing in certain ways to avoid the charge or on-site treatment. So, the decision was made not really knowing back then how the planning system could be used to avoid things. So eligible for offsets are these types of this range of subdivisions. And I have to say also in development services schemes, it doesn't always work, the 5 hectare rule, because at the end of the scheme sometimes, or towards the end of the scheme sometimes, there's constraints found and there's not enough space available to do all the treatment that's required. And occasionally in the schemes we need to defer to offsets as well, and that decision gets made by Melbourne Water. That needs to be reviewed, I think. The rate currently is $6,645 plus an admin fee, which has existed since the beginning. It's always been the same. It's measured in dollars per kilogram of nitrogen treated, because it's considered the limiting factor in Port Phillip Bay health, and also when you do music modelling, that's the limiting factor. So if you catch nitrogen, you always catch sediments and phosphorus as well. It's based on the cost of building regional wetlands that provide economies of scale, and as we found that's a limitation as well, as we're running out of space and we need to build in other areas which are far more expensive. There's another it's a bit of a, I don't want to call it complication, but the rate is also translated from dollars per kilograms into dollars per hectares to be consistent with the development services scheme charges, which are in dollars per hectares. But there's there's conversion going on, and that can make it complicated to track the deficit and what we've achieved. So going forward, I'm wondering if that's something that should be changed. The rate has been established for the 38 councils that we have in the Melbourne metropolitan area, and it ranges. So this is the rainfall distribution map for Melbourne, and people probably can't see that, but in the west it's very dry. We only have mean annual rainfall as low as 400 millimetres per year, and the northeast, the blue area, is up to 2,100 millimetres. And so where there's more runoff, more pollutants get generated off the land and end up in the receiving waters. So the rates in the northeastern areas are the highest, and in the western areas the lowest, because less pollutants get generated based on the music modelling that we use. And the vision was, as I found out through this stakeholder consultation, the vision was initially the reason why it was set up for all these different councils was that councils would then take the rates and develop their own schemes. As we know, that hasn't really happened until very recently, and there's a talk after me that explains one of them, which is great. So it hasn't really been caught on really with councils. Another sort of, I think, limitation, I think, of the program. The Essential Services Commission has endorsed the rate. It gets reviewed every 2 years. And that's how the rates changed over time. So it used to be 800, roughly, I think, dollars per kilograms of nitrogen, and it's now up to almost 7,000. And we do know the rate's too low still. It's been too low in the past, it's too low now, because it's based on the regional wetlands that we can no longer build. And it hasn't looked into the future. So what we know, we have a deficit that we need to deal with that we have no funding for at the moment, because we do works now based on funds we collected in the past, which can never be enough to cover what we need to do now. So that's a shortcoming of the program. It was set up initially with the future in mind. But somehow, the program didn't really get reviewed, just the rate, and somehow that got lost, and future costs didn't really get considered. It was just always looked at costs to build regional wetlands now, and land acquisition costs have risen. That's a big learning that we've already taken away. So I better speed up. So just a few graphs to show. So we spent basically what we collected in the Port Phillip catchment. In the Western Port catchment, we haven't spent what we collected yet, and that's because we're running out of sites to spend the money on. And even though in the Port Phillip catchment we spent what we collected, we know we have a deficit, and I don't have numbers there because we're trying to calculate them at the moment. I couldn't do it in time before the presentation, but we know we have a deficit, and that's because we haven't collected enough funds. And we also, so this is the next slide actually. So we have a demand and supply deficit. So we've already used up all the low-hanging fruits, basically, used up all the end-of-pipe wetlands where we used Melbourne water land. We don't have Melbourne water land anymore where we can do this, so we used up all that flat curve already. So now we need to find other areas elsewhere where it's more expensive to build, and so we're getting into that sort of higher curve, but the demand is high because the cost seems to be still too low for developers. It's quite attractive for developers still to pay the offset. So what we need to do is we need to look at what is the future cost. So that sort of identifies the deficit. We need to look at where is that curve going into the future, incorporating all the future costs. Also, waterway, the impacts on waterways aren't really considered at the moment. It's just the bay impact. We should take that into account as well to protect waterways. So we need to find where is that curve for future cost, and then the new offset rate would need to be where the demand meets that cost, basically. So that's a piece of work we need to do. So sorry, second last slide. So we know we have lots of limitations, unfortunately, but I thought it's a really good opportunity to share them today with you, so you don't make the same mistakes as us. And there are some strengths. So yeah, the rate is too low, unfortunately, which causes this deficit that we have to deal with. The impact on waterways are not really considered at the moment because we have basically mostly invested in these end-of-pipe regional wetlands, so we're not actually getting any benefits for our waterways. Western Port Bay at the moment is not considered because there were no targets, but targets will be sediment-based, so we need to take that into account going forward. End-of-pipe approach, yeah, as we know, that's not environmentally very good decision to make. So we should be really investing in those catchments where the shortfall of treatment occurs, or even higher up, where you can actually still protect a waterway before it gets degraded. The lack of shared responsibility is a problem because it also creates a lack of understanding, a lack of capacity. The stakeholder consultation found that a lot of councils don't even know that they have a responsibility to do on-site treatment or to get it done, and so it just shifts all the responsibility to Melbourne Water and overall Melbourne Water's ratepayers, and doesn't really get dealt with within the municipality where the impact occurs. Stakeholders during the consultations, local government told us many don't have enough technical capabilities to assess the applications, whether they are eligible for offsets or not, and there seems to be a great misunderstanding based on the stakeholder consultation. Basically, almost everybody said that they think an offset can be deferred to when it's a cost feasibility, not a technical one, which that was news to me because I thought it's when it's not technically feasible, that's when you're allowed to defer to an offset, but everybody else seems to think, oh, if the cost to treat on site is higher than the offset, then I can go to the offsets, and lots of councils defer to the offsets as a default position because that's the thinking at the moment. It seems like we have a lack of control. We don't have a good decision framework in place for local government that holds people accountable for why they made the decision. So therefore, we can't really say, sorry, don't accept your decision. And so we just have to accept it and collect the money and do something with it. Another limitation is the financial system at the moment is set up. We can only spend the money on Melbourne Water assets, which stops us devolving the funds to partners and invest in other areas. And the subdivisional trigger is a limitation. The good things about the program is it's accepted by developers, so you stop all this fighting and carrying on and time wasting. It provides them with a service that I guess they should be provided with. We can get some treatment done for impacts that would probably otherwise not be remediated, so it's always better to collect the money than not doing anything. It does give us some level of control. And recently, the last review, the rate review, created a shift from just looking at the nitrogen treatment focus to achieving multiple outcomes such as healthy waterways and bays outcomes, alternative water supply well-being benefits, so including stormwater harvesting and those sorts of things. Last slide, so I hope it's not too much. So at this point, and so there might be more learnings that come out of this, but I'm wondering, have we created a monster? Should we just stop the program? Because the original intent was to do something with, in the absence of any legislation. The legislation is now here, or has been there for a while. Is it really still necessary to do this? That's one option. Others could be to improve the program. Clearly articulate that the link between stormwater and waterway health, which hasn't been done very well to date. Try to devolve funds to partners to invest back in those areas where the shortfalls occur, or invest them higher up in the catchment to protect valuable waterways where they haven't been degraded. That's another option that could be possible. Develop possibly a different type of metric that covers waterway protection criteria, so flow standards and sediment. So could that be an impervious charge? We're sort of still, early days still thinking about everything. A grants-based program seems to be a better way to do it, rather than and having a dedicated team. So I think the program in Melbourne Water suffered from a lot of organisational change and discontinuity in terms of it got moved between teams and information got lost. So a grants-based program might be a better way to administer it. Develop a clear decision-making framework for when it's really appropriate to defer to an offset. It should just be a last resort. Rate should be, reviewed and updated based on what's the future cost, the future types of assets. There won't be regional wetlands anymore, where it will be invested. Cost to mitigate waterway impacts and the demand and supply. Acknowledge that and improve the engagement, because there seems to be a lot of a lack of understanding of what the program is about and why we're doing it, and we really need to apply a continuous adaptive management approach to keep the program functioning properly. I think that's it. Thank you.